The Holy Gospel according to Matthew, the 5th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. Jesus said, "You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until it is all accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the dominion of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the dominion of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the dominion of heaven." This is the gospel of the Lord. Grace and peace to you from God, our Father, our Sustainer, our Redeemer, our salvation. Amen. So last week's gospel text was the Beatitudes. The blessed are the fill in the blank here. These Beatitudes mark the beginning of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. This is a period of preaching and teaching that spans chapter 5, 6, and 7 of the gospel according to Matthew. I don't know if Jesus had signed up for some preach-a-thon or what was going on there, but he had a lot to say. And so these people who had been following him from all over had been hearing about what he was doing, how he was teaching and preaching and healing and the miracles that he was doing. And they decided that this Jesus guy had some things that they wanted to hear. Now, they were also struggling with quite a few things, and Jesus knew this. So I think that's part of why this Sermon on the Mount was so lengthy. In today's reading, we hear from Jesus about who we are as faithful followers of God. And we consider what that means for how we live our lives and interact with others around us. We hear Jesus say, "You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." But what does that mean? What is Jesus talking about when he says that we are salt and that we are light? Why do these people that are gathered in the crowd need to hear this? Why might we need to hear this? To fully understand what's happening in this story from the Gospel of Matthew, I want to bring us back to our reading from Isaiah that we heard earlier. Now, the book of Isaiah is written by a prophet, or probably several prophets, and it details the story of the Israelites in their time of exile and return to their homeland, and then another time of exile and another return to their homeland. And this part of Isaiah that we read from, chapter 58, is from a section of Isaiah that is referred to in the biblical scholarship world as Third Isaiah. And it's attributed to a prophet, or again, prophets, who lived in Judah after the return from the Babylonian exile in 539 BCE. I don't really know when 539 BCE was, other than a long time ago, right? And things for these people in this time of this return from the Babylonian exile, their second return from exile, things are more difficult this time around. There's more economic oppression and just generally harsh circumstances, and people are struggling to keep the faith. They are struggling to realize that they have been delivered from their exile, and they are starting to return to some of their old ways of being, to some of their pagan rituals, because things are so challenging that they're having trouble doubting God. And so the response of the prophet in this part of 3rd Isaiah is to announce God's judgment on those who are oppressing the Israelites who have returned from Babylon. To announce God's judgment on the oppressors and on those who are returning to or falling back to pagan rituals. However, the prophet also promises the righteous that God's deliverance is soon to be delivered. That soon the shame and sorrow of the recent past will be replaced with eternal joy and prosperity. The promises of the prophet in Isaiah in verses 11 and 12 of our reading are realized, that is, they're coming to fruition in the people that are gathered and listening to Jesus during this Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus is trying to help these people to understand this, to get them to remember the promises that were foretold by the prophets, that God will satisfy their every need, and to remember that they are called to be the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to live in. These aren't just any people gathered to listen to Jesus. They are the Israelites and those that they have come to know. They are God's chosen and beloved people. But they seem to have forgotten. And so Jesus, speaking to the crowd, seeks to remind them of their identity and their calling. Yet the difficulty and the oppression continues. The work that they are called to do is set before them, yet they need encouragement from God to engage with it. Similarly, the work we are called to as Christians can often be laid before us during difficult times. And it can be tempting to neglect that work for easier or more familiar things, not dissimilar from what the Israelites in Isaiah were doing in the face of their continued difficulties. It can be easiest to fall back on older or familiar ways when we feel overwhelmed by the things that we are called to do as people of faith. It can feel easier to turn inward and to keep to our own rather than continuing to engage in the sometimes uncomfortable and difficult work of following Christ. Nevertheless, we are called to this work, and we are called to rededicate ourselves to this work time and time again. And this is where we pick up in the continuation of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. In verse 13 of our gospel text, Jesus is addressing a people who are struggling under Roman occupation. He is imploring and encouraging them to remember the work that they have been called to do, to remember who and whose they are, that they are a holy nation meant to proclaim the word of the Lord. This word of the Lord, which leads all nations to beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Jesus is encouraging these people to be what they are, God's chosen and beloved people who are called to bring peace by sharing the message of God's love. He's encouraging them. He does not want them to dim their lights or hide them away. He does not want them to forsake the essence of who they are, who they were created to be, simply because it feels easier or more comfortable to do so. Christ says to them, "You are the salt of the earth. You have a purpose that is uniquely yours as a people. Do not distance yourself from it. Do not slip into a sense of complacency or blandness. No, do not slip into blandness, but in fact, be salty. We talked about salt in the children's message, so we can brainstorm some other ideas here about what salt is used for. We got cooking, it's present in the sea, and it's used to salt sidewalks when they're snowy or icy. Can people raise their hands or shout out what other uses of salt might be? This is interactive. Yes. Embalming. Yes. Yes. And other methods of caring for the body, right? How many of you all have used an Epsom salt soak before? I know I have. What are some other things that salt can be used for? To kill slugs, yes. I have to admit that every time I read this text, I'm a child of the 90s. I think about the Pixar animated movie Bug's Life, when they're in, the equivalent of their like ant cantina, and there's a slug who orders something and he says no salt. But the bartender, whoever's serving the food, hands him his order, and the slug takes a big old bite, and then the camera pans to him and his mouth is foaming, and he said, "I said no salt." Right? So it can kill slugs, right? Take care of a pest problem. Yeah. Anything else that comes to mind? Making ice cream. Yeah, because salt, when it's mixed with ice, can make the ice even colder. Right, and it's an important part of making the ice cream for sure. Salt also softens water. If you add it to water, it helps that pot of soon-to-be pasta water boil faster. Salt can help heal and soothe. Salt can melt ice in addition to making it colder. Salt can also sting or burn, irritate, abrade, right? We hear about like salt in a wound. It doesn't feel good, even though in ancient times salt was used to help heal wounds. But nowadays we have Neosporin, and so salt in the wound is not something we try to do. But salt can also be made into exfoliating scrubs, things that help care for our skin and keep it moisturized. Salt can preserve food. And if we don't have enough salt in our body, or if we have too much salt in our body, we die. Salt is important. Salt is everywhere. It impacts every facet of our life in more ways than I honestly typically think about. Theologian and author Debbie Thomas has some really brilliant things to say about what Jesus meant when he said that we are the salt of the earth. In an essay she wrote way back in 2020, this was pre-pandemic, she entitled the essay, Salty. And she says that when Jesus calls his listeners the salt of the earth, he is saying something, well, several somethings that is really profound. First, Jesus says that you are salt. He is not saying you should strive to be salt. You should work to be salt or work on becoming salt. Jesus says you are salt. We are already salt. We are salt, which can enhance or embitter, like adding just the right amount of salt to a dish or adding too much. We can soothe or we can irritate. We can melt or we can sting. We can preserve or ruin. For better or worse, we are the salt of the earth, and what we do with our saltiness matters. Debbie Thomas has a way with words. What we do with our saltiness matters. And she says, secondly, It's important to remember that up until the last 100 years or so, salt was one of the most sought after commodities throughout the world. Because think about it, it wasn't as readily available as it is now in convenient packages or large quantities, kosher or ionized, right? It wasn't as readily available. It wasn't something that people had just laying around in excess, yet it was something that people had many uses for. So it was always in demand and it was important. I also learned in this deep dive into saltiness that I did this week for this sermon that salt was in fact so valuable and precious that Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt. And this practice of using salt as compensation eventually gives us the word salary that we use today. Right? Now, I have a whole quote here about a linguist who wrote about how it happened, and I'll just give you the highlights, right? This compensation of salt to the Roman soldiers was called their salarium, right? And we see the Latin root in that word for salt, sal, S-A-L. And this Latin root can also be recognized in the French word salarié, and eventually it made it into the English language as the word salary, compensation. Suffice to say, salt was a hot commodity with immense value, especially during the time of Jesus' life and ministry. So when Jesus says to this assembled crowd at his Sermon on the Mount that you all are salt of the earth, he's identifying everyone in that crowd as something and someone of great value, importance, and worth. To those who were gathered in this crowd, as Jesus taught this story, this lesson, as Jesus proclaimed that you are salt, this was more than just a metaphor. See, it was an unexpected and radical proclamation of worthiness, value, and preciousness. Because generally speaking, the people who were gathered to listen to this Sermon on the Mount were not among the elite, the wealthy, or the powerful. They were people simply trying their best to make a life amidst the difficulties of living under Roman authority. And like I mentioned earlier, most of these people were also Israelites. And in the eyes of the Romans, they were foreigners who posed a threat to the Roman way of life and rule. And more than that even, they were a drain on resources and were really only ever as valuable as the amount of heavy labor that they were able to do. So these people that are gathered, they had very little to no status. And they were part of the marginalized, people who were passed over and ignored. Debbie Thomas understands this reality and spells out the exact kind of people that Jesus, people in Jesus, peepus, that's a new one, okay. The exact kind of people Jesus is calling the salt of the earth. She says that those gathered at the bottom of this mount-turned-lecture podium, those that comprise the you all of today's gospel text, are those who are not cleaned up and shiny and well-fed and fashionable. They are those who have been rejected and wounded, unloved and forgotten. And so when Jesus says to them, you are the salt of the earth, Jesus is saying you are valuable, you are precious, you are essential. And Jesus is commissioning them to go out and do the work of ministry. So Jesus tells us that we are not to try and be like salt. He is telling us that we are salt. And Jesus is saying that because we are salt, we are highly valued. despite having done nothing to earn it and being thought of as less than in society. We are salt right now already. And we are as precious and valuable as salt, not because of our status or wealth, but simply because we are God's beloved. Now, Debbie Thomas continued on in her essay that I mentioned earlier, saying that salt is not meant to stay contained and inactive. It is meant to give of itself, to share its unique flavor in order to bring out the best in all that surrounds it. Makes sense, right? Salt just sitting in our pantry, never being used, isn't going to do a whole lot for our cooking or our health. Salt in a container by itself does nothing. And if this is true of salt as a mineral and as a spice, then it is also true for us, the people who are the salt of the earth. We're not meant to be contained, to stay in one spot, to stay in our comfort zones, in our containers. We're meant to go out in order to effectively do the work of being salt. And I know that y'all here at Christ the Servant have a legacy of not remaining in the walls of your church. You don't stay in your comfortable container of this sanctuary in this community that you have built, but you go out into the world. You allow yourselves to be scattered as the salt of the earth. Not because you're trying to just get more butts in the pews, right? But because you seek to share God's love and to serve your neighbor so that you can enrich the world around us like salt enriches a dish. You all seek to care for your neighbor and to be in communion with them. These are the ways that we are to be scattered as salt. This is what God calls us to do because we are salt. And finally, and maybe the most important, salt, that is us as followers of Christ, is meant to enhance and not dominate. Right? If the salt in a dish is overpowering or too dominant, the dish becomes bitter. It becomes difficult to enjoy and honestly sometimes outright inedible. And Debbie Thomas says that Christian saltiness heals, in that it fails when it dominates, because instead of eliciting goodness, it destroys the rich potential around it. She says that salt poured without discretion leaves a burnt and bitter sensation in its wake. It ruins what it tries to enhance. It repels. So while yes, Jesus, by calling us salt, is calling us precious and valuable, our preciousness was never meant to make us proud and self-righteous. It was meant to humble and to awe us. And so we are called to be salt, to live wisely and creatively and in balance, not to dominate situations so that we may risk making them bitter, but to enhance with God's love and grace and mercy, so that God's kingdom might be known on earth, a kingdom of spice and zest, a kingdom of varied depth, flavor, and complexity. Y'all, we are the salt of the earth, called to enrich the world with the good news of God's love, called to be poured out and shared with all, not kept away in isolated silos of familiarity and comfort. Otherwise, are we anything more than a fancy crystal salt grinder of pink Himalayan salt sitting in the back of a cabinet waiting for a special occasion? No, we're called to be out. We're called to be scattered. We're called to be creative and inclusive. We are called to be scattered, but not to dominate, not to overwhelm. We are the salt of the earth. We are God's beloved children who have been named and claimed by God through the gift of holy baptism. in our identity as both child of God and salt of the earth is a calling for us. We are all salt of the earth, called to be who God created us to be and to live each day in faith as the kingdom of God draws near. And so may we continue to be the salt of the earth, to remember that we are the salt of the earth, that we are scattered out in the world to melt the ice of hatred, to enrich the depth and breadth of life, and to preserve the goodness of God that resides in each of us. You all, we all are the salt of the earth, the light of the world, called to be an example of God's love, grace, and mercy, called with a specific purpose to be used by God. Amen.